biggest idiots in war. History may have its fair share of heroes, but it has twice as many fools. From an arrogant general who was literally told that he was walking into a trap but went there anyway, to a brain-dead half-wit who killed 90% of his country's male population in an unwinnable war. Here are some of history's biggest idiots. Torpedoman Lawton Dawson. For our first pea-brain prat, let's go back in time to World War II. It was a sunny afternoon on November 14, 1943, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt was aboard the battleship USS Iowa, crossing the Atlantic Ocean on his way to a very important meeting. Stopping off at Cairo first, his ultimate destination was the Middle East. Once in Tehran, Iran, he was going to coordinate military strategy against Nazi Germany with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Of course, being the commander-in-chief, he had a formidable escort. Safeguarding the USS Iowa from potential threats was the USS Cogswell, the USS Young, and the destroyer William D. Porter. Since the seas were teeming with German U-boats, the convoy also had to maintain a strict radio silence for the entire journey. While en route, Roosevelt, who was actually paralyzed from the waist down and wheelchair-bound in private, requested to observe an air defense drill. Target balloons were released and then expertly shot down by gunners from the Iowa and Porter. In fact, it went so well that Lieutenant Commander Wilfred A. Walter decided to order a follow-up drill. This would involve a simulated torpedo attack on the president's ship. The key word here is simulated. During this type of exercise, the torpedo's primer is supposed to be removed so it doesn't shoot out of the tube and become live. Aiming straight for the USS Iowa, the first two torpedoes stayed put as planned. Everything looked like it was going to go by without a hitch, and then Torpedoman Lawton Dawson entered the scene. He'd been entrusted with loading the third and final torpedo, so you can imagine the horror on his face when it whooshed out of the loading chamber heading straight to the ship carrying the leader of the free world. He'd forgotten to remove the dang primer. Panic swept through the deck. They only had a couple of minutes to warn the Iowa of their impending doom, but they couldn't break radio silence. At first, Commander Walter used a signal lamp to get the message across, but he communicated wrongly that the torpedo was coming from the wrong side. Then he followed it up with another incorrect message that told the Iowa that the Porter was reversing. By this point, enough valuable seconds had been wasted, so the captain grabbed a radio and yelled, "Come right, come hard right!" As the explosives zipped towards him, President Roosevelt remained remarkably calm. As soon as he had heard about it, he had actually ordered a Secret Service agent to wheel him to the deck for a better view. In contrast, his entourage were supposedly a lot less chill. Fearing an assassination attempt, it was rumored that every single gun on the Iowa was aimed towards the William Porter, although this can't be 100% confirmed. Meanwhile, the Secret Service agent, rather uselessly, tracked the torpedo with his gun. Not sure what he was expecting to achieve there. By the time they received the radio transmission, it was actually too late for the Iowa to maneuver. But luckily, the torpedo veered away and exploded about 3,000 yards to the rear of the USS Iowa. In the aftermath, the Torpedoman Dawson was arrested, becoming the subject of an inquiry in Bermuda before being transferred to face a general court-martial. Eventually, he was sentenced to 14 years of hard labor. However, because it was an accident, President Roosevelt intervened, and the bungling seaman was freed. General Luigi Cadorna. We've all seen them, and we all resent them. Since the beginning of recorded time, the slightly spoiled and dim children of the rich, famous, and successful have been handed jobs that they're just not that good at. In modern terminology, we'd refer to this special breed of tryhards as Nepo babies, which brings us to General Luigi Cadorna. The father of this infamous Italian World War I commander was the celebrated Count Raffaele Cadorna. In the mid-19th century, he had played an instrumental role in the unification of Italy following his successful capture of Rome in 1870. Naturally, his son followed in his footsteps, but there was just one problem. Luigi Cadorna was a talentless buffoon. Using his political connections to the King of Italy, Victor Emmanuel III, he was appointed Chief of Staff of the Italian Army fighting in World War I. Italy entered the conflict in 1915 with one of the smallest major armies, having only about 875,000 men and 180 artillery pieces. To put that into perspective, at the start of World War I, France's army numbered just over 2.5 million. So, what did Luigi Cadorna do with his weak force? He pursued the highest operational tempo possible. Between May 1915 to October 1917, the French launched or supported 5 major military operations. In that same period, the Italians carried out a total of 11 major operations. Yep, you heard that right, 11. And most of them failed miserably. You see, Cadorna's policy was to go on the offensive all the time, even if there was very little chance of winning. And there was very little chance of winning, because a significant amount of the battles he directed occurred at the Isonzo River basin. One of Italy's main wartime objectives was to take the strategic port city of Trieste, where the Austro-Hungarian Navy was stationed. However, in his infinite wisdom, this Italian imbecile chose the worst route ever to get there. The Isonzo River basin not only borders the impassable Alps to the east, but contains an annoying river that disrupts the battlefield. In addition, the terrain is extremely rocky, which makes artillery strikes and other fragmentation weapons even more lethal. Oh yeah, and it's also basically impossible to dig a trench into rock. Now, some say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. But this could easily work for stupidity as well. Hemmed in by the mountains that made battlefield breakouts virtually impossible. In essence, Luigi Cadorna launched the same hopeless offensive 11 times in a row. Only twice did he achieve favorable casualty rates, and when he inevitably failed, this Italian ignoramus blamed his own men rather than his own poor tactical decisions. Believing that discipline and morale were all that was required for victory, he convicted a whopping 3.6% of his entire army on disciplinary or cowardice charges. The irony was, though, that Cadorna himself was a huge coward. His last disaster class was the 1917 Battle of Caporetto. For over 2 years, the Italian forces had advanced no more than 20 miles. Then, within just 3 weeks, they lost 100 miles of territory as a result of this joint Austro-Hungarian and German attack. As his forces lost ground, Cadorna fled back to Padua in Italy, while at the same time ordering that officers of retreating units be shot. His failure was so spectacular that the French were forced to send 6 divisions to stabilize the Italian front he had so poorly mismanaged. Finally, in November 1917, the arrogant, cruel, and inept Luigi Cadorna was stripped of his command, much to the relief of everyone. Publius Quinctilius Varus. Before disaster tarnished his image forever, Roman general Publius Quinctilius Varus had been a favorite of his blood relative Emperor Augustus, who had personally installed him as the governor of several major provinces. But the haughty and incompetent Varus, who viewed anyone who was not a Roman citizen as a lesser being, was in no way suited to the position. He was, according to one Roman historian, a man more accustomed to the leisure of the camp than to actual service in war. In the year 9 AD, while the governor of Germania, Varus received reports of tribal unrest spilling across the border. In response, the pompous general made for northwest Germany, convinced that the uprising was no more than a small disturbance that he could easily crush. Believing the participants to be merely inferior barbarians, Varus did not prepare his men for a large-scale battle, and even allowed them to take their wives and children with them on the assignment like it was a family vacation. What Varus didn't realize was that he was cluelessly walking straight into a trap organized by Arminius, a prince of the Germanic Cherusci peoples, who, at least for that moment, were allies of the Romans. Having received a Roman education in his youth as a hostage, he knew that an utterly self-confident dummy such as Varus was likely to investigate the incident, which Arminius had engineered himself without the proper precautions. But then, a rival chieftain provided intel that put the entire plan in jeopardy. Arminius's father-in-law and enemy Segestes repeatedly warned Varus that he was in grave danger, but the snobby Roman simply brushed it off as a lowly interfamily feud and ignored him. Accompanied by Arminius and a sizable band of Germanic warriors, Varus led 3 legions, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, plus a throng of camp followers deep into Teutoburg Forest. Suddenly, his Germanic allies vanished, and all at once, Varus's front columns were ambushed. At the same time, a violent storm erupted, transforming all available paths into quagmires and ripping branches off surrounding trees. Then the entire Germanic force rushed out of the undergrowth, throwing volleys of javelins at the shell-shocked Romans. The Romans managed to repel the first wave, but as the rain fell, the legionaries' shields became waterlogged and too heavy, while the drenched longbows of the imperial archers became practically useless. Knowing the game was up, Varus and his commanders ended their own lives as the men, women, and children of the losing side were massacred or taken alive to be sacrificed to the pagan gods. Muhammad II of Khwarazm. Genghis Khan. What do you think of when you hear this name? If this very utterance makes you imagine ruined, smoking cities and blood-soaked streets strewn with corpses, then you're pretty close to the truth. Over the course of 2 decades, Mongolian warlord Genghis Khan carved out an empire that stretched from the Pacific coast of Korea all the way to the shores of the Caspian Sea. His successors would later extend this out to Hungary to make it history's largest ever land empire, which was about the size of Africa. Overall, it's estimated that Genghis Khan was responsible for the death of up to 40 million people. But he wasn't just a bloodthirsty conqueror. It might be hard to believe, but many of his most trusted field commanders were actually former enemies. And when he wasn't annihilating civilizations, he was actually establishing peaceful trade relations with them. With this in mind, this makes the actions of Muhammad II all the more puzzling. This dim-witted dunce was the king of the Empire of Khwarazm, which occupied vast stretches of Central Asia and Persia for about 2 centuries since the year 1077. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a trade caravan to establish commerce links with this Central Asian kingdom. However, suspicious that they were spies, a local governor had them all arrested and executed, apart from one dude who ran back to the Mongol chieftain and told him what had happened. Genghis Khan was absolutely furious, but being the measured statesman he could be, he sent a follow-up diplomatic mission to Muhammad to demand justice. His terms were not unreasonable. All he wanted was for the guilty governor to be executed and a bit of cash to smooth things over. It was at this point that Muhammad made a decision of monumental stupidity. Instead of establishing friendly relations with the fearsome Khan, who had just subjugated much of northern China, he proceeded to behead the diplomat sent to convey the message. The old saying goes that pride comes before a fall, and in this case, it was the fall of an entire civilization. What followed was the systematic destruction of the Empire of Khwarazm, which over 2 years was reduced to nothing by the Khan's vengeful hordes. To give a sense of scale, the sprawling Iranian metropolis of Nishabur had an estimated 1.2 to 5 million citizens. When the Mongols left, there were only 400 survivors. When they found the governor who had murdered the original trade mission, there was no mercy shown. They poured molten metal into his eyes, mouth, and ears to kill him, Game of Thrones style. In the end, and luckily for him, Muhammad died of natural causes before the Mongols could catch him. In total, his boneheaded actions led to the deaths of between 2 to 15 million people, and that's a low-end estimate. Francisco Solano Lopez. As we've seen, there are a lot of contenders for history's biggest idiots, but our last moron blows them all out of the water. Solano Lopez was the eldest son of dictator Carlos Antonio Lopez, who ruled the small South American country of Paraguay for about 20 years. During his father's reign, Lopez was sent on a diplomatic mission to France in 1853, and while there, he developed a fascination for one of France's most iconic conquerors. By the time of his return, he worshipped Napoleon Bonaparte, whose empire spanned all the way from northern Spain to Moscow at its height. When Lopez assumed power in 1863, he tried his best to imitate his hero. At the time of his accession, the landlocked Paraguay was the only South American nation that didn't have a coastline, which meant that they were missing out on profits from foreign trade. Furthermore, it was among the weakest of the continent's powers. Wanting to open up his country to foreign trade and to establish Paraguay as a major player in the region, he formed an alliance with another smaller power, Uruguay. The idea was to form a third regional bloc that could challenge the domination of the much larger and more powerful Brazil and Argentina. Obviously, Brazil wasn't too happy with this, so they invaded Uruguay in 1864 to make their feelings known. In response, Lopez declared war on Brazil by sacking the Brazilian province of Mato Grosso, but he also had to send reinforcements to Uruguay to help them out. The thing is, though, to get there, his troops had to march through Argentina, and the Paraguayan president hadn't asked for permission. When the Argentines objected to this, Solano Lopez, who styled himself El Supremo, made the unbelievably foolish decision to declare war on them as well. Then, to make matters even worse, Uruguay, which was quickly defeated by Brazil, was also prompted to declare war on Paraguay. Through a combination of ignorance, hubris, and sheer stupidity, Solano Lopez had committed his country into a fight they could not win. In May 1865, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay signed an agreement called the Triple Alliance. Within a month, they had already demolished the Paraguayan navy and gained a foothold on the strategically important Parani River, which meant Paraguay was no longer able to supply its armies in Argentina. In other words, within a month, El Supremo had already lost because he had no other choice but to go on the defensive. His defeat at the Battle of Tuiuti, the largest engagement of the war, a year later would set the tone for the next 4 years. Against all military logic, he ordered his men to trudge through a swamp towards fixed enemy positions with virtually no artillery support. Over the course of a single afternoon, his entire army, one of the biggest he had ever had at his disposal, was decimated, and 6,000 lay dead on the blood-soaked mud. By January 1869, the Paraguayan capital of Asunción had been captured, and Lopez was forced to retreat to the hills with whatever was left of his ravaged ranks. Increasingly desperate and paranoid, he recruited women, children, and the elderly into his force and executed anyone who even hinted that he should surrender. His victims included military officers, cabinet ministers, foreigners, and even his brother and brother-in-law, who were shot for treason. On March 1, 1870, Lopez made his last stand at the Battle of Cerro Cora against the Brazilians. While fighting alongside his troops, he was severely injured by a lance. As he scrambled into a river to escape, he was put out of his misery by a bullet to the head. This leads us to a statistic that defies belief. According to the highest estimates, roughly 2/3 of Paraguay's population of 525,000 had died by the end of the war as a result of combat deaths, disease, hunger, and exhaustion. This includes a staggering 90% of all Paraguayan males. I'll repeat that, 90%, leaving only about 28,000 alive. This makes it proportionally one of the costliest conflicts in all of history. And all because one Napoleon wannabe thought he could defeat the combined might of 3 nations at once. There is no other word for it. This guy, and indeed all others on this list, are total idiots. At Simple History, we've been working with talented artists on something truly special, a collection of official, premium wall art that captures history's most incredible characters. These aren't just amazing pieces of art, they're timeless treasures designed to inspire and spark conversations for years to come. As a thanks to you, our amazing Simple History community, we're offering an exclusive 25% off these prints. Unlike fleeting trends or short-lived crazes, these prints are designed to be timeless, a lasting treasure you'll proudly display for years to come. They're perfect for any space. Imagine them on the walls of a classroom where they'll inspire students and spark meaningful discussions. Or picture them in your home or office where they'll show off your love of history with sophistication. Don't miss your chance to own one. Click the link in the description below now.